Have you ever wondered what the future holds for NATO following Ukraine's conflict with Russia? It's a question that's been echoing in the halls of international diplomacy and in the minds of political enthusiasts worldwide. Let's start by understanding what NATO is. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a political and military alliance of 29 North American and European countries. Its primary purpose? To safeguard the freedom and security of its member countries through political and military means. It was born from the ashes of World War II, with the goal of promoting democratic values and preventing the spread of conflicts. Now let's shift our focus to Ukraine and Russia. The conflict between these two nations has been a prominent issue on the global stage for the past few years. It's a conflict that has seen a sovereign nation's territory annexed, a people's rights violated, and international law flouted. This conflict has brought NATO's role into sharp focus. On one hand, NATO is committed to protecting and preserving peace among its member countries. On the other hand, Ukraine, not a NATO member, is a nation under assault. The question then arises, what is NATO's role in this conflict? Should it intervene, even though Ukraine is not a member, or should it stand by, adhering strictly to its mandate of protecting only its member countries? These are not just questions about military strategy or diplomatic protocol. They are fundamental questions about NATO's very purpose and future. They ask us to consider what NATO stands for in the 21st century, and whether its original mission is still relevant in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. This conflict has opened the Pandora's box of questions about NATO's relevance and future. To understand the future, we must first delve into the past. Our story begins with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. As new nations emerged from the ashes of the USSR, Ukraine and Russia found themselves on diverging paths. Ukraine, with its rich history and cultural ties to Europe, sought closer ties with the West. Russia, on the other hand, sought to maintain its influence over the former Soviet states. The early years of the 21st century saw Ukraine oscillating between East and West. The Orange Revolution of 2004, fueled by allegations of electoral fraud, propelled pro-Western leaders into power. Yet just a few short years later, a pro-Russian government took the reins. Fast forward to 2014. The Ukrainian people, fed up with corruption and the government's pivot towards Russia, sparked the Euromaidan protests. These protests culminated in the ousting of then-President Viktor Yanukovych, a staunch ally of Russia. But the story doesn't end there. The power vacuum left by Yanukovych's departure was quickly filled by Russia's annexation of Crimea and the subsequent conflict in eastern Ukraine. Russia's bold moves were seen by many as a direct challenge to the post-Cold War international order. Now let's talk about the socio-economic factors. Ukraine's economy, heavily dependent on Russia for energy and trade, was hit hard by these events. The conflict disrupted trade routes, damaged infrastructure, and exacerbated the country's economic woes. But the conflict wasn't just about economics or geopolitics. It was also deeply personal. For many Ukrainians, the struggle was about identity, about deciding whether their future lay with Europe or with Russia. This conflict didn't just happen overnight. It was the result of a complex mix of factors and events. In the face of crisis, how did NATO respond? When the conflict between Ukraine and Russia emerged, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, found itself in a tight spot, caught between its commitment to collective defense and the nuances of international politics. NATO's response was multifaceted, encompassing diplomatic, economic, and military dimensions. Diplomatically, NATO pushed hard for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, urging Russia to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and facilitating dialogue between the involved parties. On the economic front, NATO, in conjunction with its member countries, implemented a series of sanctions against Russia. These measures were designed to pressure Russia into de-escalating the conflict, but they also drew criticism from some quarters. Critics argued that the sanctions were largely symbolic, lacking the teeth to truly influence Russia's actions. In terms of military response, NATO increased its presence in Eastern Europe to reassure its member countries and deter further aggression. It also provided support to Ukraine, although this support was non-combat in nature, focusing on areas like training, advice, and equipment. But NATO's response wasn't without controversy. Some critics felt that NATO's actions were too timid, arguing that a more forceful response was needed to send a clear message to Russia. Others, however, praised NATO's measured approach, noting that a more aggressive stance could have escalated the situation and led to a full-blown war. There were also debates within NATO itself. The alliance's decision-making process, which requires consensus among its 29 member countries, proved challenging in the face of differing national interests and perspectives. In short, NATO's response to the crisis was a balancing act, navigating the fine line between deterrence and escalation, consensus and disagreement, action and restraint. NATO's response to the crisis has been a mix of hits and misses. Every action has a reaction. What does this mean for NATO? Let's delve into the implications of the conflict and NATO's response on the organization itself. The Ukraine conflict has not only generated a storm of geopolitical turbulence, but also sparked debates on the very relevance and effectiveness of NATO. For starters, the internal pressures faced by NATO are manifold. The organization has been subjected to a litmus test, with its collective defense mechanism under scrutiny. The conflict has illuminated the schisms within the alliance, with some members advocating for a more assertive stance, while others tread cautiously. Moreover, political developments within member states, such as RFK Jr.'s potential third-party run and the so-called Putin wing of the GOP, may complicate NATO's internal dynamics even further. Externally, NATO faces the daunting task of managing the ripple effects of the conflict without escalating tensions. It must also contend with the perception of its effectiveness, or lack thereof. The organization's response to the conflict has been criticized by some as too passive, raising questions about NATO's capacity to uphold its core principle of collective defense. The debate on NATO's relevance in the 21st century has also been reignited. Critics argue that NATO, conceived in the shadow of the Cold War, is ill-equipped to navigate contemporary geopolitical landscapes. Others, however, maintain that NATO's role as a bulwark of democratic values and collective security is as pertinent today as ever. The conflict has also stirred discussions on the future of NATO. Should it reform to meet newer challenges like cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns? Or should it maintain its traditional focus on collective defense against military aggression? These are not easy questions, and the answers will shape the trajectory of the alliance. The Ukraine conflict has indeed put NATO in a difficult position. It has exposed the alliance's vulnerabilities and challenged its unity. Yet, it has also provided an opportunity for introspection and change. As NATO grapples with these implications, the world watches with bated breath. The conflict has certainly put NATO in a difficult position. So, what's next for NATO? As we grapple with the aftermath of the Ukraine conflict, it's clear that NATO stands at a crossroads. The alliance was founded on the principle of collective defense. An attack on one is an attack on all. But the Ukrainian crisis has challenged this premise, prompting us to ponder, what shape will NATO take in the future? Many experts argue for a more robust NATO, one that can deter aggression not just by means of military might, but with diplomacy and economic pressure. Dr. Douglas Macgregor, a retired U.S. Army colonel and military analyst, suggests a future NATO that is more agile, more focused on strategic deterrence, and less reliant on large, static military deployments. On the other end of the spectrum, some voices call for a reimagining of NATO's role entirely. They argue that NATO should transition from a military alliance to a more political one, focusing on promoting democratic values and resolving conflicts through peaceful means. They envision a NATO that champions human rights, democratic governance, and the rule of law. Then there are those who believe NATO needs to expand its geographical scope. With security threats emerging from various corners of the globe, they argue that NATO should become a global alliance, capable of addressing challenges wherever they arise. But perhaps the most pragmatic view is that NATO will need to adapt to the changing geopolitical landscape. This might mean strengthening its cyber defense capabilities, investing in emerging technologies, and forging new partnerships. As former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen once said, NATO's future lies not in its past, but in its ability to change. All these scenarios are possible, and perhaps the future of NATO lies in a blend of them all. But one thing is certain, NATO cannot afford to remain static. It must evolve, adapt, and reform if it is to remain relevant in a world that is rapidly changing. Only time will tell what the future holds for NATO. To sum up, we've journeyed through NATO's existential dilemma, explored the roots of the Ukraine conflict, and examined NATO's response. We've also delved into the potential implications for NATO and speculated on its future in the post-Ukraine conflict world. The uncertainty is palpable as this conflict has thrown a spotlight on NATO's role and relevance in today's rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. As we continue to watch the unfolding events, we can only hope for a peaceful resolution that strengthens NATO's role in ensuring global security.